Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's 4R Nutrient Stewardship Webinar Series from Field to Market Canada with guest speakers. We're going to give everyone another 2 minutes, let's say, to make their way into the call, and then we're going to get rolling with the presentation. So we'll get to the details of the session here in a few minutes. So just give us a minute or two. Thank you. And while we're waiting, Karen, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Thank you. And while we're waiting for people to join Espartaco, can you maybe just give a quick 30-second overview of your link that you've put in the chat box right now for those attending, if they're interested in joining or accessing the Canva sort of whiteboard for accessing notes, etc. Just walk them through that briefly, please.
Yes, of course. So for this webinar, we've created a whiteboard here. You can see all the instructions of how to use it on the left side here. So let's say that one of the presenters is saying something on a slide that I like, and I want to make a note. I can just put a sticky note and say, who is Dan? Right? I don't like it, so I can erase it. But if you click here, you can go to see all the other presentations. You can move to the specific presentation and ask questions there, or you can ask questions in the chat or raise your hand in the call. We're just doing this so we can make sure that we keep notes of what everyone says, and we can have something tactile for everyone to take home at the end of the meeting.
Thank you, Espartaco. Okay. We're cognizant of everybody's time here today, so we don't want to leave it too long before we get started, but I think now we'll get started with my sort of introduction for the day, walking you through the timeline of what we're doing here this afternoon and a brief introduction on Field to Market Canada. And then as people join, we will hopefully be moving on to the meat of the conversation, which is our 4 guest speakers talking about various aspects of 4R nutrient stewardship. Okay. So this is the first in a series of webinars that we will be hosting over the next few months, focused on various topics to do with sustainability. But we're happy that you're here today, and we thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. So today's schedule, I know that we allocated about, I think we sent out maybe a 3-hour window for this. It's not going to take 3 hours. So we'll be all wrapped up and sending you on your way by about 2 p.m. Mountain Time. So about 2 hours to get through the content we have here today. The schedule is going to start with me here now providing a brief overview, introduction of Field to Market Canada, and then we're quickly going to move on to our 4 guest speakers. So first and foremost, we've got Dan from Random Cross Consulting. Dan is going to be providing an introduction to 4R nutrient stewardship, some background on what 4R is, the history, where it came from, just to set the context, set the stage for the remainder of the conversations taking place this afternoon. Next, we're going to be followed by Karen, the president of Varesco Solutions, who's going to be giving more of an overview of 4R from the angle of quantifying emissions using 4R as a baseline for emission reduction rates. She's going to be bringing more of the industry perspective around 4R. Then we're going to have Chris, the president of Collective Impact, is going to be joining us to provide more of a grower perspective regarding 4R. And how Collective Impact is working with growers to ensure that their interests are taken into consideration regarding the whole 4R concept. And then finally, our own Espartaco is going to be speaking from Field to Market Canada regarding how we are building a 4R nutrient stewardship module onto our existing Fieldprint calculator platform, which I'm going to be introducing here briefly. So that's the structure for today. Each speaker has roughly 15 to 20 minutes to present their content. We will follow that with a brief Q&A session. So If you're taking part in this webinar, you have two opportunities to raise your questions. One, at any point, please enter your question in the text box that's available on the right-hand side of your screen. Or when we get to the Q&A session following each individual speaker, you can use the raise your hand function. So there's a little hand at the top of your screen. If you click that at any point, there'll be a raised hand next to your name on the webinar. We will get to you and have you ask your question. So again, thank you for joining. First of all, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to Field to Market Canada. So for those of you who have not heard of us, we are a member-driven organization working to create productive and profitable opportunities for the agricultural value chain here in Canada. We provide outcomes-based sustainability indicators with the goal of providing results that can lead to improvement in the sustainability of agriculture over time. We are a country partner of the Field to Market North American brand out of the United States. So we collaborate to provide more of a North American approach to sustainability. However, all of our outcomes, our methodologies, our algorithms, our data sources are regionally specific to the Canadian context. So they are very much focused on Canada, and we align ourselves whenever possible with the national methodologies coming out of the HOLOS model and developed through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Just a brief snapshot of our membership. You can see our two newest members at the bottom are Croptomistic Technology and Richardson International. So we're over 20 members here in Canada, and we categorize members into four categories. So we have agribusiness, brands and retail, NGO, civil society, and association. Our governance model for Field to Market Canada is represented by at least one representative from each of those four membership categories, which allows us to maintain what we call a multi-stakeholder governance model. So that's sort of our governance structure
so
for Field to Market
Canada. The dates I'm getting, they're all in January 2026.
So whoever's speaking right now, can you please mute your microphone? Thank you very much. Our products, so what we offer to our members are basically two key value propositions. We have our national indicator reports. We have published 4 of those going back to 2011 for the first publication, and the most recent one in February of 2023. We published our latest report. Now, what these are our way to provide progress report to direct our future efforts to stay at the forefront of sustainability here in Canada. So we provide benchmarks for the sustainability of commodity crop production in each of the provinces that we operate in, which are Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. So those results go back to the early 80s, all the way up to 2021, I think, are the most recent results. The second value proposition or value offer is the Canadian Fieldprint Calculator, which is essentially provides a survey tools that's grower facing. So any grower can access that tool, any producer can access that tool, enter their farm and field level data and get an individualized sustainability report back on their individual farms and fields that basically benchmarks their sustainability or the sustainability of the commodity crop production on their field with regard to energy use, GHG emissions, land use efficiency, and soil erosion risk. Now, again, our methodologies, wherever possible, are aligned with the national methodologies here in Canada. Specifically, energy use and GHG emissions are aligned and have been updated in the last year to be aligned with the HOLOS model and AAFC. The Fieldprint Calculator itself has been completely rebuilt or is being completely rebuilt starting in January of this year, and the new version will be available in 3 weeks, so as of August 31st. The changes that have been made to that tool are essentially making it more grower facing, so more accessible to producers. It's a free service. Any producer can access this tool, enter their data, and get a confidential sustainability report back. The changes, we've integrated more things like GIS mapping capability, things like that basically allow a producer to select their field, their locations on a map, and that pulls in a lot of data from ECCC, AAFC, things like soil type, surface form, slope class, that sort of data, rather than having the producer estimate what that is. It just pulls it in from pre-existing maps. And then finally, just to close out my introduction to Field to Market Canada before we kick things off, at the last webinar presentation, the last speaker series session today will be my colleague Jesper Taku, who will be talking about the 4R Nutrient Stewardship module, which is a new addition we're currently in the process of building on the Fieldprint calculator. So he'll provide all the detail on that, but thank you again for taking the time to join us here today. So what we have to do now is I'm going to be handing things over to our next speaker, which is going to be Dan Heaney. So Dan, if you can take a minute to please load your slides, and I'll just provide a brief introduction to Dan while he's doing that. So Dan is with Rapid Cross Consulting, it's an independent consulting group led by Dan Heaney. He's worked for more than 30 years on various aspects of sustainable agriculture, including manure management and crop production systems. Over his career, Dan has been a member of academic staff at the University of Alberta and research leader with Alberta Agriculture, as well as holding several senior executive positions in private industry. He holds a doctorate in soil science from the University of Alberta, as well as designations as a professional agrologist and certified crop advisor. Dan's going to be giving a presentation on 4R past, present, and future, and we are currently working together on building up the 4R Nutrient Stewardship module for Field to Market Canada. Dan, thank you for joining us today. I'll hand things over to you.
Okay, thank you. And can you hear me, Harvey? Good to go? Okay. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour in 15 minutes. But what I want to talk a little bit about is some basic ideas of 4R for those who perhaps aren't as aware of it. Take a look at some of the tools we have available to help people improve their 4R knowledge. And a bit of history, and then I want to take a look at some of the some of the statistics we've been gathering on 4R implementation in Canada, and then I'm going to finish up with a few thoughts on 4R BMPs and where we some of the call them my favorite BMPs for the future. So, so just to review 4R nutrient stewardship, it's this balanced approach to economic, social, and environmental outcomes, to managing nutrients in a way that balances between these three, recognizing that with you have to have an economically viable farm in order to deliver those environmental and social deliverables. But if you're not paying attention to the environmental and social deliverables as well as the economics, you're not going to be sustainable in the long run. So producers develop best management practices, or BMPs. And the whole thing with this is that the best management practices need to be appropriate to their cropping system. The farmer needs to stay in charge of the process, with advice from science advisors, certified crop advisors, professional agrologists. But it's the farmer has to be comfortable with adopting appropriate practices for his farm in terms of logistics and those other considerations. And of course, the little catchphrase of all this is applying nutrients at the right source, at right rate, right time, and right place. And then finally, part of this whole process is it's a continuous improvement process. So your results are measured, evaluated, and adjusted within something called a 4R plan. And so every year the 4R plan moves forward with the farm, and it becomes embedded in the whole crop planning cycle. So a little bit of quick history here. 4R is actually a Canadian innovation. The initial conceptual framework was developed at U of S back in the 1980s. Terry Roberts, who became the the CEO of IPNI, was one of John Stewart's graduate students back in the 80s. And so Terry sort of took this concept from U of S, and then IPNI during the 2000 to 2010 period really started to develop it out. If you look in that, the literature from that area, those you see the foundational documents, Tom Brulsema, who's on the call with us today. I see Tom's name on a lot of those, Adrian Johnson's, Terry Roberts, and a bunch of the other guys and gals from IPNI from that period. And then industry adoption and promotion really got started in, I'd say, about 2010. And Karen will probably comment on that, because the first really practical application of the 4R planning process was within the nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol within the Alberta regulatory framework for greenhouse gas reduction. But there's just a little quote from the, this is from the ancient texts of 4R, that from Thorup and Stewart in 1988 is, the foundational, some of the foundational work. So where has it come from 2010? And I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but in 2010, we didn't have a lot of resources to get the 4R word out. As I say, there were some foundational papers were out. IPNI developed a 4R manual in the early part of somewhere in around there. I can't remember the exact date. We started developing training materials, and today we have this awareness and implementation set of tools that have really, I think, built, and I don't have them all here by any way, but we have, within the Certified Crop Advisor program, we now have a 4R nutrient management stewardship specialty that's available both for the prairie region 1 of the Canadian CCA program, and in Ontario. We've got an 4R industrial research chair at University of Manitoba. That's Mario Tenuta. There's been developed a 4R research network that did a lot of work during the 2010 to about 2018 period, or maybe 2020, and is now starting to be revamped again. And part of their funding came from something called the 4R Research Fund. And I see, Claudia and David Burton, Claudia Wagner-Riddell, sorry, a little bit of a mind slip there. We're on that part of that research network, and Claudia did some, great work on corn in Ontario, and David was working in the Maritimes on some of it on potatoes. So right across, and then Western Canada, we had people like Jeff Shono at U of S and Rich Farrell at U of S, and I don't want to miss anybody, but that just gives you an idea of the quality of researchers we had working as part of this program. So we've got a 4R designation program, which is a way to get growers started down the path of using a 4R plan and building more 4R principles into their operation, et cetera, et cetera. MOUs with various provinces, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba. So it's really, and then they'll finish that little spiel with this piece here, the Fertilizer Canada on their website. They have a full set of e-learning materials that we're just going through and updating, revamping. Some of them are getting a little dated. They're 10 years old now, but still good fundamental information on 4R. So are we making any progress on this? So the fertilizer use survey, which is one of the tools that we use to keep track of what's happening on the farm in Western Canada, and it's a survey done by Stratus at the behest of Fertilizer Canada. and a number of other partners. And so they go out and they do quite detailed surveys with about 1,000 farmers a year, maybe a little more. And so this is from the 2023 survey that went on last fall. And so what we're seeing, I'm not going to go through it all, but what you're seeing there is the number of farmers who said their practices meet 4R requirement is continuing to trend higher. The percent of farmers with a 4R plan increased in 2023, and those without decreased. Those with a 4R plan say there are multiple benefits. So most people who have adopted a 4R plan or developed a 4R plan find it a useful endeavor. And those without a 4R plan say there are many reasons. Lack of proven benefits, lack of incentives are the top two factors that came up. But really, a 4R program is about where are you now and how can you move forward. So, you know, the idea is there's lots of ideas that can be implemented on the farm that are probably fairly cost effective regardless of the farm. So, and this is just from the fertilizer use survey, and I hope you can read it. It might be a little small if you're on a small device, but basically we have asked them two levels of question. One was for nitrogen, and we did it for phosphorus and for different crops. This is for canola in nitrogen. And we had this level 1 series of criteria that if they met that, they were level 1 compliant with 4R. And this is just, you know, to track where things are on the farm. And then level 2 was level 1 plus they're working with a 4R designated agronomist. And I don't really have time to get into the 4R designated agronomist program, but you can go onto the Fertilizer Canada website and see what it's all about. It's basically 4R designated agronomists are CCAs or professional agrologists working out in the field, and they've gone through some training for on 4R, and they are working with farmers to do 4R plans. And then the final thing is they report the number of acres that are meet 4R criteria. So you know, one of the great things about 4R is it's a principle-based approach. So it's really adaptable to any production system. You can develop best management practices for any system. So we see, you know, we see it mostly used in, you know, broad acre agriculture, but more recently I've seen, you know, 4R in horticulture, 4R in greenhouse management. So it is adaptable to any kind of crop production system. So as I say, these are the, you know, principles, and then those principles are used along with local data, with science-based evidence to start to develop BMPs that are locally relevant to the production system. And to help along with that, we have spent a fair bit of time then developing some guidance documents for growers and agronomists. So, you know, they get an idea of what is 4R and what is not 4R in, you know, in their region. So, you know, we've done that for P, and we've done that for N, and we've done that for about 9 different cropping systems across Canada. We've done it for inclusion of manure, and so these types of tables of BMPs are available. So there's the one for nitrogen. At this point, I just want to make a point that there's 4R BMPs, which are, you know, you could think of as good practice. But then there's another more restrictive set of BMPs, and Karen might touch on these a little more, where you're actually trying to comply with a standard or a protocol to reduce your environmental impact, in particular nitrous oxide emissions. So I'm not going to go into that too much, but so where can we make some progress? So, you saw that there's a higher level of, growers are moving to that level 2 of adherence to or consistency with 4R principles, or the 4R when their 4R plan. But one of the areas that I think is still ripe for improvement, it's been improving gradually, but is the use of, is in the rate area. And this is mostly for, my experience mostly been with broad acre crops, but is setting different rates for different fields. And so this is just from last year's fertilizer use survey. And you can see that gradually we're moving up as more and more growers go to some sort of field or subfield specific rate setting. But this is, I think, an area where there's still a lot of room for movement and improvement. And I'm just going to give you a bit of a taste of why I think this is important. This is a group of elite canola growers. This is just under 3,000 fields from 2022, and they're spread across Western Canada. This was part of a project I was involved in with measuring or estimating greenhouse gases and sustainable agricultural practices based on 4R. But here's what I wanted to really show you was this is the yields in the bottom bar. The top bar, you can see the minimum, average, and maximum. The bottom bar, you can see the distribution of yields by across, just a distribution graph. But I want you to look at those two little arrows at the bottom. So this is the Western, 41 was the Western Canada average from Stats Canada that year. And 50 was the yield average from this elite grower group. This elite grower group is all using field-centric or field-specific fertilizer rates. There's lots of variability in there, but in terms of, within the farm, they're adjusting their rates by field. And probably about 2/3 of them are actually using variable rates. So, the idea of adjusting your fertilizer rate, which is really the one you can adjust most easily on the farm, is this data would suggest that there's a fairly substantial benefit to doing that. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to touch on, and then is the N2O emissions from fertilizer. As most of you are aware, about 3 years ago, the federal government came up with a target of a 30% reduction from fertilizer nitrous oxide emissions by 2030. Pretty ambitious goal. This is some work that I was involved in a few years ago, about in 2022, where we looked at the people that do the NIR, the National Inventory Report, shared some data with us that they use, and we looked at, we broke it out and looked at what the target would be in relation to the baseline, which was 2020, and we came up with 11.8 megatons of CO2e. And what I just wanted to show you here, though, is, what are we aiming for? We see that, most of the emissions are from the prairies because that's where the highest fertilizer use is. In terms of Ontario and Quebec are, they're high emitters too. Not that they have the acres, but they have the climate that leads to higher emissions, and they have the crops like corn, where you get into higher fertilizer rates. So, the target, really to meet these kind of targets, we have to focus on, those 5 key provinces, and we have to focus on annual crops. And that's not to say, potatoes in Prince Edward Island aren't important and there can't be progress there, but if you're really going to move the needle, you have to deal with those big columns there. The other thing I'm going to bring up here is that we're still unsure what the baseline is, because the National Inventory Report, which is used for the baseline, keeps changing a little bit on us. So that becomes a 30% of what becomes a relevant question as we continue to go forward. Okay, so a couple more to go, and then I'll be quiet. So I mentioned earlier that we have these very prescriptive BMPs when we're actually looking at something like developing offsets or carbon offsets for based on reduction of nitrous oxide emissions. Of course, nitrous oxide, very potent greenhouse gas. 270 sometimes more potent than carbon dioxide. And so, this is from the Alberta NERP. So if you want to participate in the Alberta NERP, which is a regulatory protocol, we call it 4R Climate Smart now, but you have to specifically do these types of practices. And then if you look over to the right-hand side, you'll see that there's some reduction modifiers. And so this is just a quick and dirty introduction then to the idea that by doing certain practices, managing your source rate, time, and place, you can get some pretty significant reductions in those nitrous oxide emissions. And finally, these are my three favorites for the future. And, going forward, in terms of BMPs that I think we need to start spending a little attention to, doing a little more research into. The first one is section control. The technology is mature. I think there's a good ROI on it. And where we're probably a little short of data is the reduction in N2O emissions, which I think theoretically isn't real hard to think through, but actual empirical data on that is a little tougher to get at. And when you think about it, if the N2O emissions are tied to the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil in the ammonium and nitrate form, and the movement of ammonium to nitrate releases N2O through the nitrification process, and then the nitrate can be denitrified, which also releases N2O, and then some of it can be lost as leaching, which ends up being indirectly contributing to nitrous oxide emissions off the farm. So cutting down on the doubling up of the nitrogen rate, I think, is a pretty solid approach to helping reduce nitrous oxide emissions. The other one that I think is interesting is removing unproductive acres. The technology is available to start to assess this kind of field by field, looking at what acres are actually making money and which ones aren't. Primarily, this is a microeconomics exercise. You have to have your variable and fixed costs, and look at things like yield maps and soil maps, and start to sort out where the inputs are working and where they're not, in terms of bottom line. And another part of that, I think it would be greatly enhanced if we actually had an ecosystem service market develop, and a robust market where some of this, putting things into permanent cover, and that actually paid the farmer for that. And then the last one is more of a technology thing, where I think there's a lot in the next 10 years we'll see around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and process-based modeling for nitrogen and phosphorus recommendations, fertilizer recommendations, and more move to data-driven decisions. With that, some of the work I was involved in over the last few years, we developed a machine learning approach to soil testing, and found that it gave pretty reasonable accuracy, and was quite a usable tool. what was great about that kind of approach was it would also tell you if you were a particular field or a particular zone in the field, it would tell you if it was a good, a good estimate of the soil nitrogen levels or phosphorus levels, or it was a bad estimate, in which case, if it was bad, you'd know you had to go out and actually do a soil sample. So that's I don't know if I was over 15 minutes or not, Harvey, but
you were perfect, Dan. I couldn't ask for
okay.
better timing. Really appreciate it. And we couldn't have asked for a better introduction to 4R and to set off the day here. So very much appreciated, Dan. I really, that last slide in particular, I liked a lot of the work that or a lot of the suggestions you're talking about for the direction things need to go. And I'm happy to see that we're actually, working on a few of those tick boxes ourselves. So really good to see that. I also appreciated the slide on sort of the potential benefits associated with variable rate application. That's a nice concrete example for all of us to see the work that we're doing and the potential benefits. So if anybody has any questions specifically for Dan at this time, now would be the time to either raise your hand or enter them in the chat box. And while people are doing that, and before we move on to Karen, Dan, just to ask you sort of to elaborate a little bit further on one comment you made. You gave a good historical overview here of 4R, and you planted the seed with sort of University of Saskatchewan or Saskatchewan back in 1988. This concept was sort of born, and it took really until 10, 15 years ago, early 2010s, for it really to take off. So in your own words, in your own opinion, why is it that that really was the inflection point? It really took off in about 2010. Like, what changed? Was it consumer demand for sustainability data, or a story, or what really is driving this, you think?
Well, I think it's, see, we'll go back there for a minute. I think it's a number of things. One was we had a group at that time that was strongly tied to industry, and the industry wanted to get out in front of the whole sustainability concept, right? And so we had some real great champions in people like Terry Roberts that would take this concept and build it out. Like I mentioned Tom, Adrian Johnson, Cliff. But we had this group, IPNI, that was international. They were all strong scientists in their own right, and they were really the ones that could work with the Fertilizer Canada, the Fertilizer Institute in the US, the International Fertilizer Association, and then that got built out globally. There was projects in South America, projects in it moved into Australia. So I think it was those two things. Was one, it was the need to get out in front of sustainability, the demand for sustainability, and then just having a group that could do the work. And that has been one of the things that has been a bit of a loss over the last few years, is the loss of IPNI. I mean, there's other groups, other channels, but that group of very dedicated people to do that kind of extension and outreach, and support the scientific side of it.
No, thank you, Dan, and thank you for your response. We'll give everybody here, some time during the next presentation. I'm sure there will be some more questions. Espartaco, yeah,
Just
go
have
ahead.
one quick question. Could you explain what you meant by section control?
Okay, section control. Most of the I'll use Western Canada as an example. So most of the seed goes in the ground and fertilizer through the seed drill. And so the seed drill will be sectioned, as in they'll have somewhere between 6 and 10 foot sections. with a number of openers. They may have a seed opener. They may have a mid-row band opener, but the fertilizer goes down through, it's controlled at this section level. So what you do then is you've got the field, you can map the field, and then as the tractor pulls it through the field, you know where the the width of the cedar, which might be 80 feet wide, you know where each section is in the field. And if you are crossing over an area that's been previously seeded and fertilized, it either shuts that section off, or it may it will shut the section off. It may lift the openers out as well. It depends. So by doing that, you get away from things like, double or even triple applications on headlands when you're turning around. You get away from, if the field has a lot of obstacles in it, you're working around sloughs, even a square field, right? I mean, if your cedar, the drill doesn't fit in terms of even dimensions into the field, right? That last pass that you're bringing up the middle or maybe up one of the borders, you may be laying down half the drill, maybe reapplying, doubling up on seed and fertilizer. So section control controls all this automatically. So it allows the grower to go out and drive their best path through the field, and the software working with the controllers on the drill will turn things on and off as needed. So if that was the question, as I say, the more you cut down on doubling and tripling up, the less nitrogen fertilizer you have in the ground there, and the less the less losses you're going to have, or the less nitrous oxide emission, because the emissions, I mean, the growing conditions are important, but the rate of free nitrogen is also important in terms of emissions.
Definitely. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that, and appreciate your presentation. And I'm sure following Karen's presentation coming here in a minute, there may be more questions, and feel free, any speaker, to jump in and tackle those. So while I'm providing her introduction, I'll ask Karen to start loading her slide deck for her presentation. But Karen is the president of Resco Solutions, which is an international environmental consulting firm based in Canada. They specialize in sustainability, climate policy, and natural solutions. They support clients across various sectors, including agriculture, forestry, and industry, helping them develop and implement strategies for reducing carbon emissions and enhancing sustainability throughout supply chains. Resco is known for expertise in GHG emission quantification, carbon offsets, and the development of sustainability programs. They've played a pivotal role in the creation of carbon offset protocols in Alberta specifically, but also more broadly. And they have projects in over 13 countries across the globe. So they offer end-to-end carbon road mapping services to help clients identify decarbonization opportunities. So Karen is going to be speaking here today, and she'll provide her own introduction, but on 4R and I believe NERP. And Karen, over to you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Harvey. Thanks to Spartco. And thanks, everybody, for having us discuss this application of the 4Rs into a market-based mechanism. And it continues to grow. So I don't have anything to add to the introduction, Harvey. You did a great job. Thank you very much. But if we take a look globally at what's available around nitrogen management protocols, the story hasn't been so crystal clear. I'll go into the application of the 4Rs into the Alberta nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol in more detail after this, but it's really important to understand where things haven't worked so well in the marketplace. So we've got the NERP the NERP protocol, we're on version 2.1. It derives from our national emissions inventory methodologies. And just like HOLOS does, there's alignment with the methods for calculating and quantifying nitrous oxide emissions in Canada, which is good. We were involved with the Climate Action Reserve and adopting 2013 protocols into the aligned Ontario-Quebec Western Climate Initiative process with California, and that's going to become important a little bit later on. And a lot of the folks who are on this call have contributed to the development of these types of approaches, the top two, over the last 17 years as we've been trying to deploy, develop, customize, generate new versions, trying to make these things work on the ground. We had and we still have, in the Climate Action Reserve in California, a U.S. nitrogen management protocol, and they're on version 2.1. First came out, I think, in 2018, and they've been modifying it over time, making it more sort of coefficient-based quantification. It's easier to scale and deploy that type of quantification. There were two under the American Carbon Registry back in the day, 2010, 2011, when we were starting to work on the Alberta nitrogen management protocol. They have been inactivated because they have not been used. They could not generate tons, not for lack of trying. And the first protocol was very similar to the Michigan State University protocol that was part of Vera's canon of protocols, VM22, and it was a nitrogen rate reduction. It had been modified once or twice. So the American Carbon Registry, very similar to the Vera one. And then it was inactivated a month ago. Nobody was using them. Rate reduction wasn't an attractive option for growers at that time. Things have progressed a little bit. We have biostimulants and biologicals that may be able to justify nitrogen rate reduction, but these protocols, part of the problem with them, and even as we get into the other ones, which are broader and include biogenic soil carbon sequestration, so Vera's VM42 or Climate Action Reserve Soil Enrichment Project Protocol, they take historical averages of intensity from baseline years. Depending on the type of protocol, they take a 3-year average of cropping history or a 5-year average of cropping history, trying to capture a rotation. And you are comparing nitrogen planning in a historical context to today's, in deploying nitrogen planning. And we don't do that. The nitrogen planning today has become so far, as Dan pointed out, that it's very important to have it context-based, both from a temporal perspective, working with the conditions expected, the residual N, what will the moisture be, what were the yield goals, is very specific now. And so those conventional baselines of historical practices comparing to practices today do not work well, and that's been a major challenge. So I just wanted to set that context that we've had a lot of problems over the years trying to deploy not just 4Rs, but these types of nitrogen management protocols in a context that is required today. So if we take a look at where we've been, when we first started with developing a nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol in 2008, it was a very new concept, a very new framework. Dr. Terry Roberts and the IPNI bringing forward the 4R nitrogen type or stewardship process, and we embraced it. We started off with the Ontario Corn Calculator and the technical working group at the time in Alberta, when we were organizing and developing protocols, said we can do way better. It's not just about reducing nitrogen rate. If you're not controlling for the other risks that will cause N2O to evolve, as Dan talked about, nitrification, denitrification, ammonium. If you start to convert to nitrate, we are in a challenge situation for controlling the risk. This whole idea of moving and embedding this 4R nitrogen management plan was embraced by the technical committees that were part of the process. And so it is risk-based, and Dan made the point, very important point, that the practices that are in the performance levels of the practice suites, and I'll get into that in a minute. Dan had a slide that showed in Alberta's version 2.1 what those look like. They are important to be able to, and they're more restrictive than it would be in just an NPKS nutrient stewardship approach. So end-use efficiency is also encouraged as a long-term corroboration of how well are you managing the nitrogen in your cropping system. Because we're basing it on the National Emissions Inventory, it can be adapted to any region in Canada. And we've had a long history of versioning in Alberta, 2010, as a result of the efforts that were done from 2007 to 2009, and then version 2.0. I'll talk about these versions and how things were progressed over time. And lately, in 2023, version 2.1. So the development history has been long and varied. I mentioned the Ontario Corn Calculator, and so we started the new process after we took that through with a technical working group and said, no, we can do better. It's not just about rate, it's about controlling the other things that can influence nitrous oxide or the nitrification, denitrification processes in the soil. And so we did a ton of work on technical review, working with experts and getting it coordinated. And at that time, not only was the nutrient stewardship framework new, so was the International Standards Organization project-based standard, 14,464 series of 1, 2, and 3, project-based being the process that is used in most of the carbon markets to develop protocols. It was brand new. It was just published. And so we embraced these two innovative things to develop what we thought was the next generation of protocols for quantifying carbon. And so version 1, October 2010, people were trying to implement it. If you go on to the Canva board, you will see some slides I'm not going to present, but it shows the history at the bottom of the Canva board where my presentation is, of 3 slides in light blue that just show the attempts at companies and project developers trying to implement these things. We started a 2-year protocol validation study to understand with project developers and their farmers, what are the challenges with the version 1? We knew version 1 was ahead of its time, that the technology and the variable rate adoption at that time and the understanding of how to use all that equipment and data that's coming at growers from their equipment and off their equipment was a challenge, but we wanted to develop something that was going to be future-proof in a way, and it was difficult. And so we did another gathering of technical working group of experts. We proposed changes, and I'm going to go through those to make it more implementable. And then Alberta Environment and Parks, who is the regulator in Alberta, published version 2.1 after public consultation in March of 2023. So that's our trajectory. This is just the touch points that we are basing it on the National Emissions Inventory methodology, but collecting primary data from the farm to quantify the changes on farm, whereas the inventory people will look at secondary data like nitrogen fertilizer sales and then do some allocation across the country in terms of what that means for N as applied for the calculations of the inventory. But as Dan pointed out, we had a change in the inventory, which quantification method. So it was updated, and the moisture curves, I'll talk about those in a second. The original NERP in 2010 had the 3-year historical average. And when we did piloting in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, because you've got that lockdown nitrogen management planning for different externalities, and you're averaging it and comparing a go forward, we didn't always see reductions. We sometimes saw increases in emissions. So we introduced these dynamic baselines where the baseline is calculated every year to compare to in version 2. I'll get into that in more detail. And then Alberta published NERP version 2.1. I'll do a little comparison later, but the updated National Emissions Inventory methodology with the moisture curves from Liang et al. 2020 are embedded in NERP version 2.1. We did a lot of work with practitioners in understanding those BMP practice combinations. And there's training that Fertilizer Canada has prepared for the accredited professional advisors, we call them, under the protocol. And so 4R based training, not only in the 4Rs, but also in assessing N2O emissions. So there's this training package that's available, and Fertilizer Canada is updating that as we move forward. So in version 2, now that's prior to now the new version in Alberta, we greatly streamlined the GHG calculations, working with the technical committees and understanding how we might rise above the agronomy of it, of a 4R nitrogen management plan, as we call it in the protocol, and try to simplify and aggregate the quantification. So we said we could reliably do it if we looked at the summed mass basis of application for nitrogen inputs and the sum of the mass for a given crop on a farm. And that removed the need to track area, which from a verification point of view, you have to verify, third-party verifier providing assurance. It also streamlined the process of verification. So that allowed roll-up to the crop or farm level for calculating, so long as they're in the same eco-district, because eco-districts are the accounting unit, the quantification unit that is used in the National Emissions Inventory and, of course, embedded in these protocols. And so alternative baselines, we've got dynamic ones, and that means, and I'll get into that in a second, that you're calculating the baseline every year. You're deriving it from the project year. So it's a counterfactual baseline, which is what we call these types of baselines in carbon protocols. There's a lot of jargon in this space, but that allowed for the current year's planning, residual N, accountability for the optimized rate, and then working on controlling source time and place for risk of N2O emissions. So just at a high level, this is the methodology. Dan alluded to the direct N2O emissions, and then the indirect pathways. All are quantified and affected by the nitrogen fertilizer that's supplied and the plant residue N that's left in the soil. So it is very high level schematic point of view. You're not using a conventional historic baseline in the dynamic case, where you are comparing that historical intensity from the base years to the project. And the testing that we did on the pilots were that emission reductions don't always occur in practice. And if a grower is going to invest in the data collection that needs to be done to support and evidence to support a carbon project, not seeing an emission reduction is not a good thing. So the dynamic baseline was introduced in version 2, and you are calculating through these reduction modifiers, I'll talk about those in a minute, the baseline. And so it's the same exposure to weather and externalities, market-based decisions that may drive a grower's choices for his objectives on the environment, economics, and social. And then same crop mass and nitrogen is used in the baseline and project. Just a word on the change in the moisture relationship within the old and the new. So what we saw was a linear relationship that was driving N2O emissions at the eco-district level based on empirical measurements. The migration to now this regression curve, which we feel is, more realistic as you're applying more nitrogen and you've got more moisture, you're getting this curvilinear response. So that's the difference in the new inventory. And what that means is that for the eco-district, and these aren't exactly eco-district, they're aggregated a little bit, but we got this graphic from the inventory group within Agriculture Canada and Environment Canada Climate Change, you're drier now, right? The moisture curve down the lower part, your growing season rainfall is drier. So you've got about a 30% lower base emission factor that you are using with in the quantification. So it's a bit of a challenge. In the moisture regions, it's still quite high, but remember that a tier 1 quantification on N2O emissions, according to IPCC, is about 1% of applied nitrogen is lost as N2O. So we've got this really much more refined scientific-based evidence for Canada that we're working with. When we adapted it into Ontario and Quebec, and many of you on the call were involved in this process, we looked at all those other protocols. The Climate Action Reserve and RESCO teams had a criteria list that we went through. The Alberta NERP came to the top as the candidate protocol. And we worked with those 4R BM tables Dan mentioned on NPKS with the Ontario Agribusiness Association as a starting point, because those are the larger nutrient stewardship BMP practice suites. And we worked with technical experts and practitioners to be able to ratify and update the more restrictive NERP practices within the West and the East protocol technical teams. So this went on for a year and a half. We had Dr. David Burton, who's on the call, conduct a science review on what is the latest science that informs the individual practices, because there are not integrated BMP studies. Claudia's got the only one on corn in Ontario. These are expensive to do, but we use it. We use the process of the ISO 14064 Part 2 with the 6 principles, conservatism being an important principle to balance accuracy with uncertainty, because all of the research came with uncertainty, bars in it that were presented. And we worked collaboratively through, let's fine-tune the BMPs, let's then apply our logic and informed by the science and strove for an 80% consensus in agreement and no sustained objection to be able to then put in the reduction modifiers and practices in this Ontario-Quebec one. Now, it's more restrictive. It's designed to fine-tune and control N2O emissions, and then Doug Ford was elected, and it all went down the drain. But it wasn't lost. We were about 85% there. So what we have in the Alberta series of protocols right now are the BMPs, the practice suites, and these are for semi-arid soils, and the science that is old, quite frankly. And we wanted to progress the updated work, all that technical work and technical coordination and building off of the BMP designated tables. And so we wound up with something we call NERP version 2.5, which is being tested on the ground in a variety of ways. I'll get into that in a second. But really the practice suites here, we've got West and East cropping tables. We've got specific ones for potatoes and specific ones for manure. These are for small grains and oil seeds. The practice flexibility is greater, more consideration about the controls and time, source, and place, which really feeds into those reduction modifiers based on the science that was available in the 2008-2019 timeframe. And you hang your hat on an optimized rate. That's the important piece here. Now, in the Alberta protocol, they want you to soil test every year. They don't accept soil nitrogen balance, and that doesn't always work in the moisture regions of Canada, as we were informed by our practitioners and our scientists. And so you're seeing some of that compliance level 1 that Dan was talking about in the fertilizer use survey, but of course you're going to be working with an accredited professional advisor who's going to oversee the development of the plan and then also check the plan to see if it was developed accordingly. Sorry for the background noise. And so you're seeing that the ability then to broadcast in the fall when it's dry, and then thinking about split application, because we were told that not all the nitrogen can be done in spring. Sometimes you need to be able to split apply, and that's the best way to manage in many ways this fertilizer. So we've got a very, very flexible system here that we hope would capture what a lot of people are precisely managing as you're moving forward into more specific rate applications across the fields. So what's happening today? We've got a number of voluntary initiatives on the ground in Canada with this NERP version 2.5, which has been upgraded with the new National Emissions Inventory quantification. But from the implementation point of view, it's using that mass-based accounting. It's using these new tables. It's using the new reduction modifiers. And so we've got 4 projects under development in a scope 3 supply chain context, not an offset. So these sometimes called insets, but they're embedded carbon with the commodity. And so we've got the Nutrient Maple Leaf project, which has been taking through a scope 3 verifier process, sustained cert, and it's the NERP version 2.5 has been accepted. The quantification methodology, we are all excited that it has been accepted under the Value Change Initiative standard, which is the standard, kind of like the Alberta emission offset system that's available today. The clean fuel regulation, there are companies scoping the NERP levers, so the right rate, time, and place, the 4 Rs, as well as maybe some blue and green ammonia, to see how the lower carbon intensity could be used. We know that to 2026, the clean fuel regulation regulator isn't thinking about lower carbon intensity feedstock pathways, but it's coming. And then we have a project on the Clean Project Registry, which is using version 2.5. It's the largest nitrogen management project in the world. It's been verified under this voluntary registry. And so the key takeaway here is that it does work with today's farming systems. Nutrien wanted to see if it would work with their agronomists and their growers, and let's test it on the ground. And through the testing on the ground we've been doing 2021, 2022, 2023, and the acreage is expanding. At the beginning, the nutrient agronomists thought that their growers would all be at least at the basic level. But not having a 4R plan by an advisor is pre-basic. They did have 4R plans, but where they fell down and they got bumped to pre-basic was that soil test and end balance every year on the management zones was not being done. And that's where people fell out. And then we could move forward with implementing the more restrictive practices. And as time goes on, they are moving up in the levels. And so I hope I've given you enough information here, building off of Dan's foundation on how we're innovating and applying 4Rs within a context of a market mechanism. I think that's it, Harvey.
Well, that was a very, very impressive overview, Karen. Much appreciated, and built off of Dan's perfectly. So really appreciate your contributions. Now, while I'm giving attendees a minute to either raise their hand or type a question, if there are any questions, I know there was a lot to cover there by Karen. So if you have any questions or wanted to circle back to anything, feel free to do so now, or if you have any combined questions, maybe for Dan or Karen collectively, now would be a good time to raise those questions. I mean, while we're waiting for that, or potentially if people are fully satisfied, they don't have any questions, that's fine. But Karen, you mentioned a few projects that you're involved with, many projects. You mentioned one with Maple Leaf and another one Nutrien, but can you just delve a little deeper into some of the on-farm benefits from some of these practices, from these NERP-focused projects that you're involved with? Or is there any case study that you can give some sort of concrete examples of the benefit at field level for farmers?
Yeah, I might just pull up a slide to help explain this. In the early days, the markets would support like a nitrogen management only approach. We're seeing that change now. So if I go back, like if I just look at those slides I mentioned, in terms of what people are trying to do in making these things real on the ground, we're finding that these newer ones, they want you to do soil organic carbon with nitrogen management, which can be a challenge because measuring, soil organic carbon, even in the measure model approach, you're still having to go out and do robust soil organic carbon sampling to initialize the model, a validated and calibrated model. So we inherently know that if you're managing for 4Rs and more precise application of nutrients, thinking about those other practices that Dan is saying need more work, that there's going to be benefits in increased productivity. And increased productivity, that's the whole goal here. So you will have more carbon inputs happening through the plant that will build soil organic carbon, right? So you're going to see benefits in better soil health, better soil tilth, those types of metrics that maybe aren't always monetized in a marketplace, but those are the co-benefits and the ancillary benefits that happen here. And then we're seeing, farm your best acre. So to coin a term where Dan's talking about maybe doing something differently with the acres that are not productive. And being able to collect this kind of data and information that these types of applications of 4R are driving in a market pull way to better be able to digitize. I mean, how long have we talked about digitizing the farm? But if you're going down that pathway, you've got the ability to do that microeconomic analysis, to be able to say, yeah, I might diversify and do something different with that area on my farm that never really, and now I have evidence that will show that it's not as productive, and maybe I'm not gaining the benefits from that economically. And so that evidence-based in decision making is so important, and we're in an evolution here. I think that's all, very positive. And I think that, as time goes on and we get more digital data, we'll be able to realize that, Harvey. And you guys are going to help with that too.
Yeah, definitely. We're on the same page there. Now, Dan, if you're still around, would you mind if you have your slides available by any chance still? I know you had the one slide where you were sort of predicting out to 2030 here, the biggest changes that are coming down the pipeline that are going to sort of support better 4R practices, better management practices. If you have that slide available still, and you don't mind sharing your screen, I would ask that you put it up. And if not, that's okay. I have Karen here still. And Karen, I don't know if you recall sort of that list from Dan. Is there anything else that you when you had that list in front of you, you were looking at, he was talking about sort of the set aside was one opportunity coming down the pipeline to better 4R practices. There was, right here. Thank you, Espartaco. When we had that up there, section control, Dan talked about that in detail, AI, ML assisted recommendations. Is there anything, do you think Dan covers the list quite sufficiently here? Is there anything else around 4R BMPs for out to 2030? Anything else you see coming down the pipeline that's going to have a very positive impact on adoption of BMPs for the betterment of 4R?
Well, Dan, you go ahead.
Yeah. So these are my favorites, and they're based. I'm not an economist. I'm a soil scientist, but I did a number of studies in the last couple of years where we worked with Fertilizer Canada and Canola Council with an economist out of Ontario, Rob Gamble, who's former chief economist with Ontario. The Ontario grain farmers, and before that he was a senior farm management economist with OMAFRA. So well versed in doing on-farm economics. And so section control was one of the things where when we costed it out under various scenarios, section control was one of the things that really seemed to have a strong ROI. And so, we did some estimates of nitrous oxide emissions as well. based on, because we reduced the overall amount of nitrogen that was going into the field, we could use basically the NERP approach to estimate the, before and after, the, counterfactual. And so, depending on what level of overlap you had, where the field was located, all those sort of things. But we worked through that. And that was one that gave both a good economic bump and a good reduction in nitrous oxide emissions when we, kind of costed it out and tested it out. Where we were short, when I was looking for information on empirical evidence on section control, pretty skimpy, right? I mean, I'm talking about now, things in the peer-reviewed or, independent. There was a bit of work by PAMI on using section control in peas, which is probably not a great example, but, very skimpy. And then the other one that canola Council wanted us to look at was removing unproductive acres. And so same thing, we did some modeling of, some farms, sort of test case farms with removing unproductive acres. And again, this was, very good impact or big impact on nitrous oxide, and also a good impact on the bottom line because we sort of built various scenarios around that, and that material is like those reports are available on the Fertilizer Canada website, and so that's why those two were sort of top of mind. And then the other one, is this sort of digital expert systems, right? Is I think I've had a little bit of experience in that, and I just think that as we get more and more data available, and if we can organize it in the right way, and that these kind of assisted recommendations can really help fine-tune recommendations at the field and subfield level. And the biggest issue with those is the training data. So you need to collect sufficient data not only to drive the algorithm, but also you need to be able to measure the outputs of that. So with soil testing, it's fairly easy because we can train it with soil test data and then have another set of soil test data that we can test against, and we can do that sort of every year and update the the project I was involved in, update the soil tests year by year. With some of the recommendations, it's a little harder to get. It's a little harder to get training data because you have to basically look at things like yield and residuals and a bunch of other stuff, and at what an agronomist thinks is appropriate to come up with a, is this an appropriate recommendation? You need that output at the end of the season to adjust the algorithms or build. So that one's a little more work. So, but I think that given the the way AI and machine learning is taking off now, we're going to start to see those kinds of things.
And I agree, and I think that's really where, with the data-driven decision-making concept, I mean, in some ways, that's really where a group like Field to Market can play a strong role, especially with the new tools and platform that we're having available, grower-facing tools, ease of use. So we're hoping to have more sort of data entry and more data available to help sort of feed these decision-making. Now, I see, yes, we're talking, you have your hand up, but Karen maybe would like to comment first. And I think if we have no other comments from the other participants, let's let Karen go here, and then we can maybe move on to our next webinar speaker afterwards.
All right, just really quickly. The thing that Dan's got there, ecosystem services markets, like we've known that managing nutrients on the ground, the 4R framework also benefits water quality, right? And also, if you're removing unproductive acres, what are you going to do with those? There's lots of opportunities for enhanced biodiversity. So this is where that overlay comes in with other policies and markets. You know, you talk to the supply chain companies, and they're all migrating to climate and nature. And so nature has become very important from a disclosure point of view, being driven by the task force on nature disclosures, and everybody is assessing how they might move forward with enhancing net positive gain of biodiversity. So there's stuff coming that will, the 4R frameworks will drive this, I think, because it's probably the closest thing we have to getting to that digital farm. So those are really important, and that's the future.
And it's interesting, the additional benefits of taking part in webinar series like this, because we are currently working on a project with our partners on set aside and doing a microeconomic analysis of that marginal land setting aside. And so we need to line up another call, Karen and Dan, to talk about that. But there's one more comment here, Karen, a question directed for you from Dana, I believe, at Omafra. She asks if you can expand a bit on the 3 projects being explored under the clean fuel regulations. You reference them in your slides, I believe.
Yeah, so the clean fuel regulation, Dana, you know that they have used the Canadian Roundtable of Sustainable Crops footprints um, as part of the assessment of the carbon intensity of crops in Canada. And so they had the 2017 crop footprints, and the first version of the clean fuel regulation had cited that in the open LCA methodology. Now 2022 footprints are out. And so the the practitioners here who are experimenting with how do we take those and then start to put in management levers that will reduce the GHG emissions from those footprints, understanding the processes that are behind the actual methodology of the footprints. What can we sub in for management? And so that's what they've been doing, and trying to understand lower nitrous oxide emissions in particular through the 4 Rs. I hope that answers your question.
I appreciate that, Karen, and thank you for the question, Dana. And I think for the sake of time, we're probably going to move on to Chris from Collective Impact now. So Karen and Dan, thank you both so much for your participation in this webinar series, both excellent contributions. So appreciate your time. Now, Chris, I hope you're there. Now, as you are loading your slides for your presentation, I'll just provide a brief introduction. Collective Impact Agriculture. Collective Impact Agriculture is a Canadian organization focused on fostering sustainable and regenerative agriculture practices. Their mission is to connect producers, industry, and government entities to champion environmentally responsible growth while emphasizing the importance of carbon values across the supply chain. They work across multiple sectors, including agriculture, mining, energy, and forestry, to develop tailored carbon programs to help meet environmental, social, and governance goals, ESG goals. The company offers solutions that include helping agricultural producers access carbon credits and sustainability programs, as well as connecting them with resources that support practices like intercropping and regenerative agriculture. Chris Babing, thank you again for taking the time to join us here today. It looks like your slides are loaded, so I'll pass things on to you. Please go ahead.
Wonderful, and thank you so much for having me here today. Want to, present. We had a chance to meet at a field day, and was asked to come here today and present and speak on not only in terms of what Collective Impact is doing and some of the programs, but from a producer, from a farmer's point of view. A lot of the time that we spend is with farmers, and on our next slide here, we'll get to our team and talk about who our team is at Collective Impact. But while working with producers, we're producers ourselves. My partner in this, and I'll skip to the next slide. I'll skip to the next slide here if it'll let me. For some reason it is. Oops. There we go. So our team is made up of Michael Ferguson, myself, and Regan Ferguson. Mike and Regan farm at Star City, Saskatchewan. They have about a 3,000 acre farm. Mike is also involved in grain marketing. Regan is an agronomist, or has training as an agronomist. So we try to take a holistic approach when we're having conversations with producers, where we're focusing on, not just not just the grain marketing side, not just the economics, but we try to take a holistic approach when looking at all things, be it the 4R strategy, carbon credit programs, just so that we have truly have the producers focused. A little bit on myself. I'm coming to you here from northeastern Saskatchewan. A little bit on my background. I have experience in the financial services industry with credit unions. I have experience with Precision Ag Company for about 4 years, as well as crop insurance, and now working in the carbon credit regenerative ag space. So trying to bring, again, just that balanced approach. I think, following the previous two speakers, they did a great job of giving an overview and a lot of the data and science behind carbon credit programs and the 4Rs. I probably won't get into the depths that they have, and they're absolutely, they shared some great expertise. So just going to try and complement that as well here today. So just a little bit on collective impact. As the overview was, we're focused on building, implementing, and overseeing agriculture products or projects involving water quality, soil health credits, and carbon credits. We focus on balancing the program of the project's desired outcomes and the producer's economic and management practices and goals. I think this is an important point to highlight, and I'll highlight it again. No two farms are the same. No two producers are the same, and to be honest, no 2 years are the same. And so it's important whenever we're working with producers, I think in all aspects of agriculture, is to truly understand that everyone has different goals, everyone has different strengths, everyone has a different experience and different focus. So we try and understand the producers that we're working with, and just to match them to the right programs, if there's any programs that are fit for them at this point in time in their journey as well. So we also go out, collect their required data for the programs, provide educational and resources for producers who are interested in learning, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a slide. And then, again, just that educational component about sustainable farming practices, soil health, water management, and of course, financial stewardship, because I think that's a key factor. Farms are, while it's anyone who's in agriculture, it's a passion. It's a business, and it has to be a business. And the decisions that are made, there always needs to be a balance between economics and obviously the correct agronomic practices as well. Through our networks, we're connected to millions of acres across Western Canada, so have a pretty broad scope of who we're able to work with. Some of the programs that we work on or work with, NERP was just discussed at length. We've started working with producers in the NERP program here just in 2024. We administer a reductions and research program, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, reductions only program in northeastern Saskatchewan. These programs are outcome based, so it's focused on the end result in terms of that carbon, those emissions reductions and sequestrations. There is sign up incentives and certainly a focus for our nutrient stewardship, typically cover crops and tillage. One of the challenge with cover crops, and you know, I think there's definitely a link here. But one of the challenges with cover crops is that often cover crops within these programs are defined as you know, seeded after harvest and terminated prior to the next growing season. And what we run into here in Western Canada is that that's just not always feasible. Often you'll have your first killing frost. Let's say it's mid-October, sorry, mid-September. If you're just finishing harvesting a field in you know, on September 10th, you're not going to necessarily, without, you know, because you don't know when that killing frost is coming, you're not going to necessarily want to take the chance to establish a cover crop. So that's some of the challenges that we've run into on cover crops within these programs, and just trying to find different ways of you know, still making that possible, so that that living root can be there moving forward. Another program that we're involved in is a practice change program. So it's, you know, we're looking for 40,000 acres across the prairies. There's a focus on more so the practice changes, not necessarily the end outcomes. And within that program, there's premiums paid on intercropping and cover cropping. And then the last one is something that's very important to us. So it's called the Northern Plains Program. And really what the Northern Plains Program is it's a peer group that we've started here in northeastern and stretching into east central Saskatchewan. And it just has a focus around regenerative ag practices. So what we'll do is we'll find producers who are interested in learning or trying something like intercropping. And we'll provide them with the tools, the assistance, and sometimes, you know, cover some of the agronomic costs of that product, or sorry, of that project. Soil moisture, soil health, we're monitoring that. Dan spoke about marginal acres. That's been a very big focus of this program in terms of managing those marginal acres, and then also the economics tied to that. That's something that my partner here, Michael Ferguson, has focused on heavily in his farm, is the management of those marginal acres and the economics tied to that. So really what we're trying to do within that program is just provide producers any type of education, any type of sharing, and then of course, you know, economic support to make some of these changes on their farms to move towards a more regenerative focus. Those are programs we're involved in. Just in speaking to, I guess, probably more of a higher level, carbon credit programs and the 4R model, how we see them working together, and you know, in terms of why the 4R model is a pillar for a lot of the carbon credit programs. You know, it's easily understood and straightforward. Typically, you know, it's easy to monitor and measure, and there was a lot of talk about data capture, and you know, certainly while we continue to go down that road, it does become easier to monitor and measure, provided that the data is accurate and easily accessible. And I think, you know, most importantly, the core focus aligns with the emissions reductions focus, which is, you know, a big focus of a lot of the carbon credit programs that are out there, or historically has been a big focus of a lot of the carbon credit programs out there. Organic carbon was mentioned, and certainly starting to see some of the carbon credit programs focusing on that as well. But again, you know, that core alignment, or that focus aligns really well with this, and that's due to a lot of the work of those involved in creating the 4R model. Some of those who are on the call here today, and the work of Fertilizer Canada in just, you know, putting that out there and continuing to work on it. Some of the challenges within the 4R model within the carbon credit programs, and this in no way, shape, or form is an indictment or a negative about the 4R model. It's more so just how the two work together, and when we see those applications on farms, and some of the challenges that arise from that. And I'm going to, you know, highlight two things here. So again, all farms are unique, these are some generalities that we do run into from time to time within the programs. But I'm going to skip to the last point. While these are challenges, I think these are also opportunities. And it was just highlighted how some of the protocols, some of the programs are taking advancements to try and work around some of these challenges. But nonetheless, they still do exist today. But as the 4R model continues to move forward, as the carbon credit programs continue to move forward, some of these challenges are minimized, some are eliminated. But obviously, as technology changes, as changes happen, that will always unveil new challenges, new opportunities. So with that, so in the right source scenario, what we see in terms of carbon credit programs, often it's more focused on nitrogen, which it's been highlighted here today in terms of emissions, why that is. But I think what that does, or where that gets lost within the programs, is producers trying to make changes just in terms of the overall reduction of fertilizer. There's not necessarily I shouldn't say not necessarily, but not always the reward or the overall reductions that that may be from other fertilizers compared to nitrogen. And again, that's been discussed as to why that is. Another one that we run into is new products on the market. So when we talk about the right source, there's a lot of new products on the market. Some of them work, some of them don't, or don't work maybe as well as advertised, I would say. And I think some of the challenges within that is just the level of data on these new products isn't out there in terms of peer-reviewed research and that type of information, where those products, while they can be used on a farm, and while they can align to the 4R model and an overall reduction, if there's not a lot known about them, you can't always receive credit for them. They can't always be included in some of these programs. And obviously that becomes a challenge when you have a producer who's doing the right thing, trying to make reductions, trying new ways to increase that carbon matter in the soil, but it's not necessarily credited within the program. And then I think the other thing in terms of making changes on your farm, tied in with a carbon credit program, is just some of the unknown results within programs. One of the things that, to be completely honest, was surprising to me when I started working with Collective Impact is, given the amount of conversations that have happened within agriculture about carbon credits and carbon credit programs, over the years, I assumed that a lot of it would be a known science, and that wasn't the case. Where we'll have producers saying to us, what if I do this, this, and this? What will that equate in terms of those emission reductions? And because no two farms are the same, no 2 years are the same, there's often unknown results. So you have producers who want to make changes within those programs, but the data and that information isn't always there and isn't always available to do that. So obviously what needs to happen there is more programs and more research and just truly studying the results and learning how different programs, different protocols respond to those different changes. In terms of the right rate and previously there was conversations about NERP with different baselines. We still see programs that have a 1-year baseline, and some of the challenges that can arrive from that is you're absolutely tied to or dependent on what was done in that previous baseline year. So you can run into a scenario where 2021 in a lot of pockets of Western Canada was not a great year. We had even in our area where we typically almost always grow a crop. That year we grew half a crop in most of most northeastern Saskatchewan. what that resulted in is, is in soil sampling, finding that there was, significant amounts of nitrogen and other fertilizers still in the soil. It just hadn't been used by the crops. And so if that's your baseline year, that poses, that poses certain challenges, because you're looking at those results and you're making your decisions. You're making that direct comparison where, if there was only half the fertilizer used, for example, and you're now doing those testing, and you're doing those tests and making decisions, and you grow, the next year, for example, you grow a massive crop on less nitrogen. Well, it makes that year, it kind of skews the data, is I guess what I'm trying to say, year over year, with just that 1 year baseline. Obviously, there's a lot of different testing models in terms of soil sampling and analysis, measurements. Talked a little bit about virtual soil testing. There's even within that, there's different ways of doing that, and different models of doing that as well. And then obviously, when you have different agronomists looking at the results, you've got different interpretations and different recommendations. Having worked with having a variety of agronomists, it's a great thing. You can learn a lot of different things, but one of the things you learn is that everybody has different experience, different backgrounds. So at times the interpretations are different. And then the last thing, in terms of the right rate within the model and within the programs, one of the challenges we run into is just economics, where at times you can do the testing, you can understand what is the right rate for that year, but the economics may not align to that, and so producers are left making choices and making decisions based on economics versus based on agronomy. And we can have a conversation or a discussion about that in terms of whether or not that's right or not, but that's just the reality of what happens on farms in Western Canada. We get into the right time. Some of the challenges there are just efficiencies. Here and maybe this is tied to weather. I think all three of these are tied together: efficiencies, weather issues, people. Your people are your human resources. A lot of people want to do, a lot of producers, understand the right thing to do, but at times some of that does get sidelined for efficiencies. Weather issues. You can have a desire to have a split application of nitrogen and dribble on nitrogen, but if you have a very, very wet spring like we had here in northeastern Saskatchewan, the timing might not be right, and that might not be possible. And then, of course, people. You have to have enough people on your farm to do all the different things that are required in the busiest seasons, which is often when these happen. And then, in terms of the right place, there was some great conversations about sectional control, about variable rate. So we've got those highlighted in here because that's what we run into is just the equipment costs and the costs of upgrading equipment, but then also the technology aspect of things. I work in spring and fall on an 18,000 acre grain farm, and often I'll people within the industry, I'll send them videos of all the different monitors and all the things that are happening in the cab at seeding time. With your sectional control, with your variable rate technology, just with the equipment itself and blockage monitors. And it at times, when you show a cab, it looks more like a spaceship, the cab of a spaceship than it does a tractor, just with everything that's going on. And the reality is that, not everyone is as comfortable with technology and utilizing technology as others. So, that's certainly something we see as an issue when we're trying to get someone to go down the road of trying variable rate or some of these different things. And again, that comes back to your people. You don't always have the ability to have enough people, or at times the right people. I worked for a variable rate provider, and that honestly was in terms of data capture, variable rate, that was a conversation that happened a lot of the time, is that, this is a great idea, this works well, but I'm not sure that our hard help is going to be able to do this. And that there was a fear there, and that definitely impacted the adoption. The other thing I think, when it comes to variable rate within some of these programs that we run into, is there's just not the recognition in all the programs of utilizing variable rate. You can switch over from what we would be considered to just a standard rate across a field to variable rate, and you're now putting the fertilizer, the nutrients in the right place. But if you're following your soil testing, you may not have an overall reduction of fertilizer, and a lot of these programs is based on an overall reduction of fertilizer, and not recognizing that variable rates being used. NERP was highlighted where that's one of the key pieces, and that is part of NERP, but it's not part of all the different programs. It's certainly not part of all the different programs, especially inset programs, where you're not able to recognize that, or you have multiple applications or multiple methods of applying. Even something in it's not directly tied into fertilizer, but variable rate fungicide or variable rate desiccation. Just trying to ensure producers are rewarded for doing those things is certainly a challenge. And then in terms of rate place, one of the other things that we do run into, and especially in a year like this, is just unknown moisture conditions. Producers are trying to make decisions. In the fall of 2024 for 2025, and to be honest, even I look back at this spring, at the start of seeding, we were able to seed everything corner to corner for probably the first 10 days of seeding. After that, we were down. We were shut down for 9 days because it rained straight for 9 days. Well, that certainly changed the landscape of those fields. And to be honest, had it been that had we had that moisture level, previously or prior to seeding, I think there would have been producers that absolutely would have made changes within their own fertility plan. But you don't know what you don't know at times, and so that's another thing that we certainly run into in terms of the right place. But as I mentioned, these are opportunities as well, not only in producers making changes on their farms in terms of technology and practices, but within the carbon credit programs as well. And this is feedback that we certainly provide to those that we work with around these programs, a lot of which are food companies for inset programs, just to try and ensure that what's happening in the fields and what's happening in Western Canadian agriculture is so recognized, because there's a lot of great things happening as well. So last slide, again, we're trying to connect producers in the regenerative ag industry for the betterment of the land and their financial bottom line. That's our passion, and so if people are interested in learning more, you can check out our website. So with that's what I had prepared for today.
Chris, very much appreciated. I think that was a nice follow-up from the previous two presentations, and exactly sort of the angle that I think we needed for this to round out this webinar, for providing really the farmer perspective, the grower perspective on 4R and regenerative practices and practice adoption, and sort of to look at it from the other perspective. So we really appreciate that. Anybody participating in the webinar today, if you have any questions, again, please type them like Dana did earlier for Karen. And Espartaco, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for joining us and having this talk with us. It's very informative to have a farmer, or having a farm group come in and tell us what the real truth is on the ground. And we talk a lot about like these changes in management practices, but I wanted to ask, from your experience, if that change goes wrong, not because of something that the farmer did, but let's say that the moisture, it started raining out on that year that they decided to try a new management practice, what do you feel is the time that it takes for them to recover, either like recover the confidence to try out that new program again, or to like recover financially, or even to recover like that trust that they had with you as a consultant or as a advisor? What do you feel are the costs of that risk?
That would probably depend on exactly what happened and how completely sideways it went. to be honest, you know, and I guess the other thing I would say is that it depends on the producer. There are producers who are earlier adopters, who are going to try things knowing that some of the things that they try aren't always going to work out. There's other producers where, you know, you're literally having to drag them forward to the changes, and if something doesn't happen or go right, you run into, you know, you're going to run into losing them for a number of years, potentially forever, to be completely honest. You know, one of the things that we always said when I worked at a precision ag company is you had about 15 minutes when it came to variable rate. If a producer rolled into a field and was trying to load prescriptions for that field, if it wasn't working, and this, you know, this wasn't standard with everyone, but if they couldn't get those maps of that prescription to load, their desire to just go ahead and seed that field with the default rate was 15 minutes. Now I've seen sometimes they're willing to wait a couple hours for you to get them a new prescription in whatever way or fix it. But often, you know, in that scenario, it's it's just, I'll go ahead and do what I've always done because it's what I know, and I know that it's going to work. So it really just depends on the producer, the scenario, and probably how big the change was to begin with. So I know that's a really broad answer, but I'd almost have to, you know, I'd almost have to speak to a specific producer and a specific example of, you know, of how, you know, that we've run into that before.
Yeah, no, because what we do and the models that we have, we want to know how, like, the tolerance that farmers have for technology and technology not going right. I guess we have the 15-minute mark that we have to abide by.
It, you know, not to make light of it, but it probably depends on the day. It probably depends on the situation, and it probably depends on whether it's at the start of seeding or at the end of seeding, or, you know, or anything else. I think, you know, that's where you run into, if you run into a situation like this year, again, you know, at the start of seeding, we had perfect conditions, and I apologize for the doorbell in the background. We had perfect seeding conditions starting out, but then, you know, you run into where you're shut down for 9 days and you're getting closer to June, and the desire to get a crop in, that becomes your default over the desire to make changes or do things differently. And so, yeah, it just, every year is different. Every farm is different.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That was just what we were looking for. I appreciate your time. And the same goes for Dan and Karen. Really appreciate your contributions to the webinar series. If there's anybody attending, and if you have any direct questions for any of these individuals, I'm sure you can just reach out to them directly to ask your questions. Now, to close out today's webinar series, we've had an introduction to 4R. We've had Karen provide really sort of a high-level industry perspective. What's the value, what the direction this thing is taking, where's it going? We had Chris come on just now, provide a really good sort of grower perspective. What are some of the challenges faced by growers? So now Espartaco is going to be joining us to speak about our new 4R Nutrient Stewardship module that we're building onto the Fieldprint calculator. So Espartaco is our data and technology lead at Field to Market Canada. Over the last 8 months, he's been helping us sort of navigate the website rebuild, the rebuild of the Fieldprint calculator tools, as well as the first iteration of this Nutrient Stewardship module, which we are building in collaboration with Fertilizer Canada and ADM Milling and Winfield United Canada. This project is funded through the Sustainable Canadian Ag Partnership channeled through the Ministry of Agriculture of Manitoba. So it's a Manitoba-focused project in this initial phase, but eventually we are going to be expanding into the broader Canadian market. So, Espartaco, please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that introduction. On the Canva link, if you go to the last slide, you'll actually get some supplemental information on what the module would look like. But yeah, I'm here to talk to you about our interpretation of what the 4R Nutrient Stewardship project would look like. So our first impression, what we really wanted to do with this was to find a way to create value for farmers. They're the ones that are going to be putting the time to fill out our model, to fill out their information. We want them to be able to have actionable results from whatever that they do with our model, with our website. So in order for us to create value, we first have to make sure that we have very little to no data input burden. That if you put that information in once, it is the only time you ever put it in, and it works for everything that we're doing with our model. 2, we see that there is a massive problem with siloing of user data, siloing of technology and models in agriculture, and we want to move away from that. We want to make sure that whatever we collect, whatever we do is interoperable. It works within our models, but also the data that we collect can also work with external parties. Let's say that you want to grab our model or the data that we collected with our tool, and you want to get it accredited by someone else. We want to be able to have that ability to collect the right type of information so that external parties can also use it without having to go back and forth and make clarification on assumptions. So with that in mind, our objective was to create a model that will help score growers' adherence to the 4R nutrient stewardship guidelines. And essentially, our goal was to allow farmers to get a baseline of their nutrient stewardship, very, very basic baseline at first. And that's going to be our first step, which is going to be released in this fall, which is what we call the binary compliance assessment. So Fertilizer Canada and the Fertilizer Use Survey has this compliance criteria, which allows farmers to know if they are level 1 compliant on their nutrient management. And if you go onto the slide, into the Canva, you can see there that I have one for nitrogen and phosphorus for wheat and canola. And so we're basing our model on that as consistency criteria. And our next step after that will then just grab the very basic yes, no binary pass fail, and then add on to it and start finding a way to measure performance and help farmers apply better nutrients and apply them in a better way for their specific field, for a specific location, and their specific soil moisture. So our approach with our binary compliance assessment, we are very basically going through the compliance criteria and saying for rate, you pass. For time, you could do better here. And then for place, you passed here because you did this. And then with the preliminary scoring, we look at more data as to like, did you use how did you apply your fertilizer and what were the costs associated with that? And can we find you a better mix that will give you the similar nutritional values for a lower cost? Now, for our model, we already have it. If you go onto our Canva, you can see that this is what it would look like. So for the right rate, might help if we look at the consistency criteria first. You have for the rate, you must do some of this. For timing, you must not do any of these. And for placement, you must not do any of these. So with that in mind, for our rate, to establish baseline nutrient values, we ask users to tell us about what their tests were and the frequency that they did it, as well as tell us more about their application rates. So with that, we can use the historical information that they've told us in the past about their previous soil testing to then use those values as default values for the new year if it makes sense. So for example, if we know that this farmer uses a very specific fertilizer mix, we can already put that in there for them so that they can then just change the specific values, the specific date that they applied it, and they don't have to double input data. For interoperability, what we focused on was using a criteria that was widely recognized, that being the consistency criteria of the fertilizer use survey, and also adding ways of being able to collect more granular data so that we don't make assumptions on data that could be collected. So instead of assuming that the soil was frozen because it was in early January, we want you to tell us that the soil was frozen, even though it was early January. And lastly, for our interoperability, we focused on documenting every assumption and to make sure that every single assumption is baked into the into the tool that the farmer is using, so that they know that whenever they click, they forget to put this value in, they know that how our assumptions will fill in that value. This will allow us to then, when someone else wants to request this data, this will allow the farmer to then give access to a third party of the data that we've collected for them, and have access to all the documentation so that there's not going to be, the handoff is going to be super streamlined. Now, for actionable results, we could just as well have said, okay, you applied UAN in the fall, or you applied fertilizer when it was frozen or snow covered, but that doesn't get. We felt that didn't give the farmer enough information, because some of them might be applying twice, 3, 4 times. So we will also pull out an example of when and why they failed, or not failed, but when and why they weren't consistent with the fertilizer use survey consistency criteria. Now, for the timeline of the release of this tool, by fall 2024, this binary compliance assessment will be released for canola and wheat in Manitoba, but we'll also be releasing the data collection tool for all provinces, so that farmers at any point in time can be collecting their data. And once we are able to release the 4R portion of our tool into their province, we already have historical data to back up whatever decisions we're helping them with. Now, by March 1st, 2025, we will be releasing the preliminary performance scoring for canola, spring wheat, and corn, but we will have the binary compliance assessment done for all crops, for all regions, for all crops and for all ecozones within Manitoba. And then we don't see that we will be releasing the 4R tool for all other provinces until December 1st of next year. And that is everything that I had to talk about. We do have an example of what that would look like within our Fieldprint calculator. If anyone is interested, all you have to do is, all you have to do is click on this and then open this link, and you can see what an example of this 4R calculator would look like on your field.
Thanks for the presentation, Sparta. I think that really gives a good overview of the direction we're going with the 4R Nutrient Stewardship module. So, I mean, for those attending here this afternoon, really we've gone through the whole overview of 4R. Dan's given the intro, Karen's given sort of the industry perspective, Chris has come in and give more of the grower perspective. So now at Field to Market Canada, we are a not-for-profit corporation. We're a member-driven organization that has the tools in place for data collection and to model sustainability outcomes at the field level. And so what we're doing here now is we're trying to take this 4R nutrient stewardship module concept and build it into an additional module that tags onto the Fieldprint calculator platform. So the users of that platform, which it's a grower-facing free tool for individual growers to use. So if you want to use it at a broader aggregate results level, That's available for Field to Market Canada members, but for individual growers, it's available. It's grower facing. It's free for everybody to use. An individual grower would be able to create an account, enter their data into the Fieldprint calculator platform, and select an option to actually go into this 4R module, enter their data, and as of ideally the end of this month, we will have an initial 4R module, that phase 1, built on and available. Going forward, I think that by March of next year, we're planning that the initial steps of that phase 2, and then so on from there. So the module is being built up over time as we move forward here. So if anybody has any follow-up, or they want to talk about, ask any questions about how this might work for an application that you're interested in, please reach out to myself or Espartaco directly. If you have any questions for any of the presenters, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer your questions at another time. Otherwise, I think we'll sort of wrap up this webinar series now and give Espartaco a big round of applause for all the work you put into this. So thank you, Sparta. If there's anything else from anybody, please follow up with us directly. Otherwise, really have a great afternoon, and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you. Okay, bye.